There is not a single mental health disorder that circadian rhythm disruption doesn't touch. I've just seen it over and over and over again in the data. The one behavior that bubbles up and is predictive of physiological and psychological functioning is sleep-wake timing. The more stable it is, the higher levels of psychological functioning, and the stronger the physiological markers.
Hey guys, how you doing? Hope you're having a good week so far. My name is Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, and this is my podcast, Feel Better, Live More. In our hyper-connected modern world, where we're exposed to artificial light at all hours and have access to food around the clock, one of the consequences is that we've drifted far away from our body's natural rhythms. But could it be that reconnecting with these rhythms is one of the keys to unlocking better health, more energy, and even a longer life? This week, my guest is Kristen Holmes. She's the global head of human performance and principal scientist at Whoop, a science advisor to Levels Health and Arena Labs, and a member of the Tactical Leadership Board of Sports Innovation Lab. In our conversation, we explore the world of circadian biology and how aligning our daily habits with our natural rhythms can be absolutely transformative for our health. Kristen explains the far-reaching consequences of a disrupted circadian rhythm, from metabolic disorders and increased aging to mental health challenges and lower immune function. She also explains the critical importance of consistent sleep-wake times, the body's need for morning light exposure, the ideal timing for meals, and how to manage factors like alcohol and caffeine. We also explore what shift workers can do to maintain healthy rhythms despite irregular schedules, and Kristen also shares her own personal experiences of how aligning her circadian rhythms has massively boosted her productivity, focus, and overall health. In fact, she shares that she hasn't been ill in over 8 years. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Kristen. She's someone who is incredibly knowledgeable and super passionate about improving the health of others. This episode is full of actionable insights, and my hope is that it leaves you feeling empowered to take control of your daily rhythms and experience the transformative effects on your health. I want to talk today about how our daily habits, things like alcohol, caffeine, screen time, affect our circadian biology and our health. But before we do that, I'd love you to explain what is a circadian rhythm and what are the consequences of us having our circadian rhythms disrupted.
Yeah, so circadian rhythms, very simply, are the physical, mental, and behavioral processes that are happening over a 24-hour cycle. And the consequences of desynchronized circadian rhythms, and we know this, there's lots and lots of evidence in the literature that the consequences of desynchronized circadian rhythms, that is basically bypassing our natural internal preferences, right? Which we want to try to match our natural internal preferences with the light dark cycle. That's like the most prominent cue to entrain our circadian rhythms and to create this circadian alignment. So, for example, when we are viewing light at a phase of the natural light dark cycle, that puts enormous stress on our body. So we know this as, viewing light at night, for example, after the sun sets, right? Or not getting enough light in the morning as the sun is coming up. So this basically confuses our system in that our internal clocks become disorganized or don't quite know what to do. And this creates misalignment. Now, there are other behaviors that help entrain our circadian rhythm. So the timing of our meals, okay? So when we're eating our food, when we are active and social, when we go to bed, when we wake up, we want to try to align these behaviors with the natural light dark cycle. So when we're supposed to be active and eating and sleeping, we want to try to do that in a way that's aligned with kind of these natural environmental cues.
And when our circadian rhythms are disrupted, as they are for so many people these days, just shed a light on some of those consequences so that everyone listening can really understand that this is actually very, very serious. It's not just about feeling good in the moment. Of course, it will help you feel good and give you more energy and more focus. But there are some quite serious long-term consequences, aren't there, when we have misaligned circadian rhythms?
There are, yeah. And, and this is the subject of my PhD. My dissertation is on circadian alignment, and really trying to unpack, what are exactly the behaviors that are going to influence our ability to create this alignment, and indeed, what are the consequences? So we know that there's an increased risk of metabolic disorders and metabolic dysfunction. We know that there is not a single mental health disorder that circadian rhythm disruption doesn't touch. So if we are chronically misaligned, our internal system becomes very confused. And this cellular miscommunication is really, I think, the basis of most disease and frankly, aging. And so it is serious. I'm inside sleep and recovery and training, and I do a lot of research across these various areas, and it's very, very obvious to me that circadian rhythms and circadian alignment is the foundation of your house. And when that is not firing on all cylinders, anything we attempt to layer on top of that is really just inefficiency, layering inefficiency on top of inefficiency. So, any nutrition protocols that we're trying to deploy, or any, exercise, like in order to really capitalize on these other things that we're doing, the timing of when we're viewing light, when we're restricting light, when we are eating, when we are sleeping, when we're waking up, and when we're active, that the timing of those things is absolutely central to our overall health and longevity.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that. I've been a medical doctor now for 23 years. And, one thing I've realized over the past, I would say at least a decade, is that if you haven't got the basic foundational pillars of health dialed in as well as you can, you simply don't know how many of your symptoms are just a consequence of that, right? So as doctors, we often will treat your symptoms and say you have this condition, and you may do, but sometimes that's just a natural consequence of the fact that you are living in some sort of circadian misalignment. So of course your mood is low. Of course your brain function isn't where you want it to be. Of course you're putting on weight, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So for many years, as much as I can, and with shift workers, it can be more challenging, and we'll talk about that for sure, I'm always focusing on, for me, what I call these 4 pillars of health: food, movement, sleep, and relaxation.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said, of course. And yeah, and I think, but where I think it's not that we don't go wrong, but I think we think about sleep, for example, right? Sleep doesn't have a circadian rhythm, but it's an output of the circadian clock, right? So it's our daytime behaviors that dictate, our ability to fall asleep and stay asleep and get that beautiful restorative night's sleep, right? But we're not really coached on what are the behaviors that actually create this beautiful night's sleep, right? We're told to spend more time in bed. We're told to focus on our sleep. We might talk about our sleep hygiene, which is very important, right? But unless our circadian rhythms are aligned, sleep is going to be very difficult. And I think that's one of the biggest problems in modernity. A lot of this is because we're living in a world where we have access to light 24/7. We have access to food 24/7. And as a result, we're creating, just a lot of stress on our system. And this manifests, of course, in things like our alertness and our ability to attend to the things that matter to us during the day. But it really, really impacts our sleep at night. So as a result, we are really, trying to push water uphill, I think, as it relates to many of the health goals that we have, because we're really not focused on the foundation.
Yeah, it was really interesting there. You mentioned that we have this 24/7 access now to light and food. And there's quite a beautiful contrast there between, constant access and the rhythmical nature of our bodies, right? We're not meant to have that constancy of access to these things, right? We're meant to eat at certain times. We're meant to see light at certain times. And until very recently, that is what we would have done. And it's this kind of mismatch, isn't there? And it's, I've been really excited about talking to you because you talk about physiology and psychology. And I'm also very passionate about those two things. I don't think you can look at physiology and how that impacts people without also looking at psychology. And so something's just come to me, right? I wrote this book on happiness, and one of the components of happiness to me is alignment, when your internal values and your external actions start to align more and more. And the way you're talking about our circadian rhythms is also about that internal and that external starting to align, right?
Yeah.
So can you just speak to that a little bit? Because I think it's really, really interesting.
I love that you highlighted that. I'm a psychophysiologist, so I study the interactions between the mind and the body, and there's no question, right? When our behaviors are not a reflection of the things that we say we care about, the things that we say we value, right? That creates this internal mismatch, this internal dissonance, right? That manifests in our life in all sorts of ways that are really unproductive and maladaptive, right? So I think there's this psychological kind of alignment, right? Where we are able to think clearly about our purpose, and we're able to practice being this person that we say we want to be in the world, right? Which is, our identity, and live our values. And that's where when we have all, really strong internal alignment. But, if we are misaligned with these natural rhythms in the world, that is going to have a profound impact on our physiology, which is going to then in turn impact our mindset. It's going to impact our motivation and our energy production, right? For the things that we care about. So there's this incredible, synergy that's happening between our mind and body all of the time. That's dictated by, these internal rhythms, right? And creating these matches is really, I think is kind of the bigger project here, right? And we want as many matches as possible. And I call these demand matches, right? Like we want our internal system, right, to be able to match the demands of our environment, right? If I want to feel sleepy when I want to feel sleepy, I want to feel alert when I want to feel alert, I want to be able to engage with the people I love in a way that feels good to me. These are all kind of matches, right? But when our internal system is desynchronized, all of that becomes very, very friction filled, right? And very effortful, right? And that creates stress on our system. So, and that stress, of course, manifests in very real ways, right? In terms of suppressing our immune system and, creating constant, activation with our HPA axis. These things are our autonomic nervous system, our sympathetic branch of our nervous system is chronically activated. This leads to disease and aging, right?
Yeah. Just so everyone who is listening really is understanding circadian biology, are you saying that everyone has an internal rhythm that has presumably been set in some way based upon their lifestyle and the way they're living, but ultimately it is internal, and our job therefore is to have external behaviors in our life that match that internal rhythm as much as we possibly can?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think where we go a little wrong is I think we believe that there is enormous variability in terms of our internal preferences. Most humans, right? And I'm gonna set aside, folks who have circadian rhythm disorders, sleep disorders, like those are unique cases. But talking about the general healthy population, Okay. There isn't a lot of variability in terms of when you want to fall asleep and when I want to fall asleep, right? Based on kind of our endogenous preferences. And we know this from, a lot of the literature and a lot of the research that's done on hunter-gatherers. They're all going to wake a little bit up after sunrise, and they're going to fall asleep a little bit after sunset, right? And indeed, when you put, folks like us on a mountain with no electricity, we're all going to fall asleep within a half an hour of each other. So this notion that we have these really, varied chronotypes that span 5 hours, that is just, I can't, when I interpret the literature, that's not what I see, right? I see preferences, and modernity has created an opportunity for us to, be awake at 2 a.m. But it doesn't mean, just because our system has adapted to it does not mean it's good for us. And I think that's the message, as hard as I think it is for some folks to hear. That's kind of the message that I'm trying to get out there, that, we're really making choices, right? And we just have to own that choice, but we have to recognize that it is having a deleterious effect on our health, well-being, and our longevity, right? Mental, physical, emotional.
Yeah, what you said about we're not as varied as we might think, I'm so happy to hear you say that. It's something I felt for many, many years now, based upon my clinical experience, which is that, night owl, morning lark, I know they talk about chronotypes. It just doesn't fit with what I've seen. I've had patients who swear to me that they're night owls, swear to me. And say, okay, look, this is the consequence at the moment of you being a night owl. Would you like to change that? A lot of them will say, okay, but is it possible? I said, okay, well, let's just try for a couple of weeks, changing a few things. Light exposure in the evening being a huge one. Let's cut that out as much as we can. Let's get your dinner a bit earlier. Let's get you up early and get you outside, right? It is amazing how many night owls suddenly say, oh, I'm doing really well as a morning lark. Now, I can't say that that's for every single person, right? And I recognize that many sleep experts are saying that there are these chronotypes. But as you say, those studies where you go out camping or they go out to the mountains, when that happens and we're removed from artificial light, it all starts to sync up a bit better, doesn't it?
It really does. And the evidence is just so darn clear to me, and I think we've created this notion of chronotype out of convenience, really, because it just lets folks off the hook. It's I'm the night owl. I'm going to stay up and I'm going to watch Netflix until 1 a.m. But, there's other evidence too, when we look at the timing of light exposure on mood and brain circuits, right? It's a beautiful paper. It was published in 2017. And basically, what it said is that when we're viewing light between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., your dopamine system, motivation, reward, just doesn't work as well as it would have if you didn't view light between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. And of course, if you're doing that, once every now and again, not a big deal. But if you're chronically viewing light between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., which is probably 70% of the world's population at this point, like a lot of folks are getting light to the eyes, which is confusing the control center of the brain, saying we're supposed to be awake, which is then telling all of the clocks in the body that it's time to be awake at times when, again, they're not programmed to be awake. They're not programmed to be, firing, right? So again, this puts enormous stress on the system. So I think studies like that tell us, okay, there's something that we need to protect this time frame.
Yeah.
This is a time when we are not supposed to be active and awake, right? And so there's just more literature that's kind of mounting. And indeed, in all of the research that I've done over the course of the last 4 years for my thesis, the one behavior that bubbles up and is predictive of physiological and psychological functioning is sleep-wake timing. The more stable it is, the higher levels of psychological functioning, okay, the more positive psychological functioning folks have, and the stronger the physiological markers. So we see relationships between when we do these circadian behaviors, they impact our sleep-wake time, which then impacts our cardiorespiratory fitness and our parasympathetic activity.
Wow.
Like this, I'm about to submit this for peer review, so this is preliminary data. Jamie Zeitzer, a professor of sleep and circadian scientist, is on the paper as well. So I'm really excited about it because this is the first time we've been able to show these really clear effects, and they're super significant. So it was a pre-post quasi experimental design. So it's just a super cool, huge data set. 338,000 folks were a part of the study. So it's super cool, but it just reinforces everything that we're talking about. That there are, it's called core four. There's four behaviors that are absolutely critical to creating, to help facilitating this sleep onset offset consistency, which we know is, again, I've just seen it over and over and over and over again in the data. God's view, sleep-wake timing is the most important behavioral experience we have, the most important behavior that we can adopt.
Okay, we're going to go deep into that because it's absolutely fascinating. Before we do, I want to acknowledge there will be shift workers who are listening to this who may be experiencing stress as they hear this. So we're definitely going to cover shift workers at some point. So I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge that there are people out there in society who do some of the most important jobs who are living with circadian rhythm disruption. And I think that's something we really need to look at as societies. What, is there a way to change that? What can we do to help them? So we'll come back to that. Yeah. What you said about dopamine was really interesting. You mentioned that if we are regularly up looking at lights between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., then our dopaminergic system doesn't work as well the following day. Now, that has some quite profound implications. Your motivation, your ability, your drive, your willingness to do the things that are required of you are going to be affected by that. So you might think you have no focus, you can't resist temptation, you don't have passion. You may think that that's who you are, that's your personality, but maybe it ain't your personality. Maybe it's a consequence of the fact that you are viewing light at midnight. And then what also happens in my experience is that because we feel like that, we then consume more caffeine, more sugar to get us through. We're consuming caffeine later in the day. And then we reinforce that belief that we're night owls because I'm not tired now till midnight. But hold on a minute. Yeah. Maybe that's a knock-on consequence of the fact that you're consistently looking at light at 11:30 p.m. You're pushing back your melatonin secretion. Everything's off, and you're then engaging in behaviors that reinforce the idea that you're a night owl. And I don't, Chris, I was thinking about this morning, right? We know that our circadian rhythm is not exactly 24 hours, right? It's slightly beyond that. And then we are setting it every day based on light and dark. So even if you accept that there are genetic chronotypes, the fact that we can change and respond to jet lag and time zones means that we can change it, and our environmental inputs ultimately are what dictate it, right? So I think it's empowering because it goes, okay, what can I do? What choices can I make to harmonize my circadian rhythm in the context of my life as much as I can?
Yeah, that was perfect. So well said, and so validating for me to hear someone like you say that, because I just feel like it's people have really, really strong reactions to kind of fudging with their sleep-wake time and, the precious chronotype. But I just think the evidence is really clear. And I've personally have been able to shift my circadian rhythm to an optimal kind of zone. And I have seen, I've been tracking my data for a really long time. Even prior to coming to Whoop, I was a really early adopter in HRV. So heart rate variability is an incredible proxy for just our mental and physical health resilience. Incredible proxy for that. So when I was coaching, I was really deep into tracking these things. So I've seen in my own experience, I as a coach, I was very much a night owl. Like I was cutting film, like late into the night. I was sending emails. I was doing all sorts of stuff during the night. And I can see now that I had just literally adapted to a lower level of functioning. And I know this because like, I didn't even know what I was leaving on the table. Like, it was just like, it's one of those moments where you're like, I thought I was being so productive, and I was, by all intents and purposes, very successful. We won 12 Ivy League championships in 13 years and a national championship. I was coaching Olympians. I was, I got my master's, I was doing a lot. But when I look back on like my health, I was a mess, and when I first got my data, I was probably 15 years old biologically relative to my chronological age.
Wow.
And I've been able to completely reverse that. Now it's in the other direction, and it's been 8 years of work, but a lot of it is just literally my first place I started was, all right, I was like, I'm going to stabilize my sleep wake time. I saw a paper in 2017, Andrew Phillips, published this paper. He's a super famous sleep scientist and does all sorts of stuff with circadian rhythms. And he did a study at Harvard and looked at the students and was just trying to understand, okay, what is going to predict GPA? Thinking that it could be sleep duration, it could be all sorts of things. And sure enough, he found that the students who had the more stable sleep wake time had better grades. So I was kind of, and I was seeing it in the WHOOP data as well. I was looking, I had, under my purview, I had thousands of collegiate athletes. And again, the one thing that predicted injury and illness was sleep wake time and sleep wake variability. So I was like, wow, this is like key. So I just was like, that's all I was focused on. I'm like, all right, what are the behaviors that are going to enable me to fall asleep at a similar time each night? What do I need to do in the lead up to bed? And then I started really getting into circadian rhythms. And that's what, kind of led me to pursue my PhD and kind of in this focus area. But it has totally transformed my life in terms of my own health. I went from a 60 HRV when I came on the platform to, now, today my HRV was 140, my resting heart rate's 49. I'm 50 years old, so it's really, it's completely transformed my life, aligning my circadian rhythms.
That is really empowering for people who think that the way that they feel right now is the way they have to stay. And it is simply not true. You can change. You can change anytime you want. Yes, for some people it's harder than others, but actually a lot of the time it's not as hard as we think. We don't necessarily need a huge lifestyle overhaul. A few simple things done consistently really very quickly start to move the needle. You said it's been 8 years of work. I found that really interesting, that phrasing, because I imagine some things are tougher than others. But I imagine also there's been a feed forward cycle whereby it was hard initially, but then you start to feel the benefits. And
it's just a way of life now.
Yeah. And then you want to continue that way. That's how I feel. I love living in good circadian harmony. I just feel great like when I do it. I know. Yeah, I don't think until people get to that point, they understand how motivating feeling good is. And when you don't do it and you feel off, like you're like, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to do
exactly.
So for example, I don't drink alcohol anymore. Now, I would never say I'll never have a drink again. I may do, I may not. All I can say is at this moment in time, given what I have to do in my life, I'm happily married. I've got 2 children who I like to see and spend a lot of time with. I help to look after my mother. I have a pretty busy and full-on job. Like, I don't want to leave 4 or 5 hours on the table one morning because I had 2 glasses of wine the night before and it affected my sleep. So no one had to tell me to stop. I just did it enough times to realize, you know what? I prefer feeling great when I wake up and having a sharp head. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's how it, so that I'm kind of, people have to experience it for themselves, don't they? Let's go to sleep wake time, right? Because I've heard you say before that if there was one behavior you would recommend to everyone, if possible, it would be to have a consistent sleep wake time. Let's unpick that. What exactly do you mean?
Yeah.
And why do you think this is one of those top behaviors for people to do? This episode is brought to you by Airbnb. Now, I've been using Airbnbs for many years now for pleasure and for work. And last year, when I was in London for a few days of work, instead of staying in a hotel, I stayed in a wonderful Airbnb, which was centrally located and had a really nice kitchen, so I could start off each day with my own food, just the way I like it. I've also just booked an Airbnb for a work trip to Oxford, in which I plan on recording a few episodes of this podcast. Now, over the summer, one of my best friends from university told me that he has been hosting his own place on Airbnb when he and his family are away. And he said that the extra money has been fantastic and helped over the years, both with the cost of their holiday and the cost of their new family car, which got me thinking, when we're next away as a family and our house sits empty, perhaps we could Airbnb our own place and make some extra money to go towards our holiday. And if you have a trip coming up, you could potentially do the same. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.co.uk/host. This episode is sponsored by Thriver, the app that helps you listen to your blood and get personalized guidance on how to optimize your health and fitness. Now, I think regular blood tests can be a really valuable tool that can help tell us which lifestyle changes are working and where we might need to make changes. And Thriver is the perfect tool to help us do that because they make it really simple. You just take a blood test at home, which is really easy, send it off, and then you get all of your results in a matter of days in an easy to understand app. And all of your results come with personalized, actionable lifestyle advice from doctors. You can then test again in a few months' time and learn what's working well and where you might need to make some changes. For example, your average blood sugar, known as your HbA1c, I think is a really important marker that gives you information on the state of your metabolic health. And I personally like to check it every 3 to 6 months to make sure it's staying in its optimal range. The Thriver app is what I use to help me do this, and it offers many different options. You can do general, non-specific blood testing, or get more focused on things like hormonal health, heart health, sports performance, and nutrient levels. For listeners of my show, Thriver are offering an exclusive offer of 20% off your first Thriver cycle when you enter the promo code LIVEMORE at checkout. Just visit thriver.co to get started today. That's thriva.co. Thriver, listen to your blood.
The behaviors that have transformed my life are democratically available and free. So when we, really is about boundaries, about, hey, how do I actually practice being the person I want to be? How do I practice living my values every single day? And for me, this was the path. And it started with sleep-wake time, really because, again, I have access to all of these data and, millions and millions of sleeps. In many of our studies, we're also looking at measures of psychological functioning. So things like workplace resilience, feelings of control, feelings of purpose, feelings of efficacy, and homesickness, in military populations, contributions to teams and frontline healthcare clinicians. So we're talking about massive data sets.
Could you just explain that actually before you get into this? The people who don't know what you do in your job and your role with Whoop in particular, if you could just explain, this data you have access to, how much data is it? Because it's science, it's citizen science, isn't it? It's a very different way of doing science than what we're conventionally used to.
Yeah, so the citizen scientist stuff is a lot of the retrospective analysis. So going back into our data set at Whoop, which is basically Whoop is a physiological monitoring device. We are capturing heart rate data. We're at very high frequency. We're transforming that data and giving our members insight into their sleep, insight into their recovery, okay, so their capacity to take on strain, and insight into their cardiovascular load. We call this strain. And when we coach them, we give them feedback. As a result, I get massive amounts of de-identified data from our members. And there's also running alongside, folks are journaling. So we know when folks are breastfeeding, when they are on their menstrual cycle, we know when they're drinking alcohol, when they report it, we know. So we have these incredible data sets to be able to look at retrospectively. So we don't go on fishing expeditions really, like we pre-register everything. So my team will pre-register before we go in and look at the data. We develop a hypothesis. We do a very traditional scientific method. We register it. So when we publish it, people can go on the registry and see, oh, okay, this is what they said they did, what they were going to do. This is what they did, right? This is where it lines up and where it doesn't, right? So we're not just cherry picking, right? We don't want to do that. So my team will do retrospective analysis, but we also do prospective research, which are, like with 1,000 paratroopers in Army Alaska, where they're wearing Whoop device. And then there's also an intervention, right? Where we're giving them a roster of some of these circadian alignment coaching behaviors. And then we have a control group who's not getting any of that. They're getting generic sleep advice, for example. So, I'll do research on those folks. I'm sitting on probably the most physiological data of frontline healthcare clinicians of anyone in the world. Wow. We've done, Stanford Medical, UCSF, Las Palmas. We've done, we're doing lots of work in those populations, trying to understand circadian rhythm disruption, how this impacts psychological functioning, how it impacts functioning on teams, how it impacts things like psychological safety, also corporate executives. So in my role as global head of human performance, principal scientist at Whoop, I'm basically in charge of kind of looking at both doing retrospective and prospective type of research, so I can understand what behaviors are going to move around our sleep, our recovery, and our training, our ability to train. So that's kind of like my day job.
What I find really interesting, you have access to all this data, but yes, you have different professionals, people in the armed forces, healthcare professionals, but you also have a lot of data from regular members of the public.
General population.
Busy people with busy lives, trying to juggle everything. You're seeing in real life what are the consequences of their behaviors on their physiology, which I think is really, really interesting. Yeah. Okay, so with all that data, having done this for years and assessed it multiple different ways, on multiple different occasions, you have concluded, along with the research, that a regular sleep-wake time is one of the top-line behaviors we should all be striving for.
No question. Yes. I mean, I think I will go on a limb and say that I think it is the most important behavior if we're talking about wanting to really optimize our health and longevity. I think when we have a stable sleep-wake time and we're getting sufficient sleep matters, right? We need to spend enough time in bed, right? There's no question. And I think, that sweet spot for folks is somewhere, between 7 and 8 hours for like adults. And I will say that when folks start to stabilize their sleep-wake time, they actually need to spend less time in bed because their sleep becomes more efficient. They don't end up with kind of that, they end up with less light sleep, less awake sleep, right? Because their sleep becomes more efficient. So this is different than sleep-deprived sleep, where you end up with, massive amounts of time in REM and sleep, like, and that's obviously it's compensatory, like it's important, like our bodies need to be able to do that. It's functional, but you don't want to be doing that chronically, right? So anyway, yes, sleep-wake time bubbles up in all of our research as predicting both psychological functioning. In fact, we did around COVID, we did with Dr. Chuck Seisler was on this paper as well. We basically we sent a survey out to all of our members. 70,000 people replied to our survey. It's a 20-minute survey where we were just asking all sorts of mental health questions, lifestyle questions. Do you have kids? Do you not have kids? Like, it's the whole 9 yards. It was a very thorough survey where we were asking all sorts of questions about their lifestyle. And basically the end result of that study, and we looked at, because these were all, members on our platform, we had the 3 months prior to lockdown, and then the 3 months after lockdown. And the one behavior that we saw that was most protective of psychological health, mental health after lockdown was sleep-wake timing.
Now, how much does it matter what that sleep-wake timing is, or is it the point that it's a consistent sleep-wake timing day to day?
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. So one of the things that we're starting to see is that, so in the healthiest population on our platform, the 18 to 23-year-olds who are collegiate athletes, okay, so we're talking like tip of the spear, genetic lotto, congratulations. These are really high-end athletes. So when you look at that population, after 1 hour of variability in their sleep-wake time, that is when we start to see a degradation in their heart rate variability and a degradation in their resting heart rate. So heart rate variability is basically a measure of our ability to respond and adapt to life stressors. When our heart rate variability is suppressed, that means our body has taken on load, life load. It could be a combination of training. We could, maybe we drank a lot of alcohol, or, we had a super heavy meal, that is going to suppress our HRV.
A fight with your partner, too much work, all sorts of stuff.
Psychological stress, absolutely. Basically, a low HRV is going to produce kind of a higher baseline heart rate, resting heart rate. You're going to hum a little bit less efficiently. Your body's going to have to work a little bit harder. So heart rate variability is an incredible proxy for just our mental and physical health resilience. Incredible proxy for that. So, and we see in the data that, when we start to get outside that hour of variability in this very healthy population, just 1 hour, okay, we see a sharp decline in their HRV and increases in resting heart rate. So clinically meaningful in both directions.
That is just 1 hour, just a 1 hour variation.
1 hour. 1 hour.
That is what I would argue that many people do that every Friday and Saturday nights.
Social jet lag.
They have a rhythm in the week and they let loose on a Friday and Saturday. But that has a consequence, doesn't it?
I mean, social jet lag is the other thing. Like you want to try to, again, like across the 7 days, you want to just try to have stable sleep-wake time. You don't want your weekday to be a lot different than your weekend in terms of variability. And we see, there was a really interesting study, social jet lag and other aspects of sleep are linked to non-suicidal self-injury in college students. This was an 885 person study where they looked at their whole entire history of non-suicidal self-harm, and then the 3 months of the study, and basically they saw that for every hour of variability between weekday and weekend, there was a 17% increase in non-suicidal self-injury.
I mean, this is just remarkable.
It's wild, right? And I mean, it's just this confusion and this misalignment. It has just profound effects. And I think what's like insidious about this, and it's like you just start, and this is what I saw in myself, it's like this really insidious, slow decline, right? And it's just every day you get a little less capable of being the truest version of yourself. And like maximizing your potential, like you just get a little bit further away from that until you literally adapt, like I said earlier, to this kind of lower level of functioning mentally, physically, emotionally. Your ability to kind of engage in your life and be present, and it just is diminished, right? And this is kind of the root, right? And that I think we're just not having a clear enough conversation about.
What kind of variability do you think we can tolerate and still have optimum functioning? Because we're the best one in the world. We may not fall asleep. Our eyes may not shut at exactly the same time every night, despite our best efforts.
And when people are trying to kind of incorporate a more stable sleep-wake time, the most important thing is to wake up at the same time every day, which you can control, and view light, even if it means potentially having a bit of a shorter sleep, that same wake up time is absolutely critical for setting your circadian rhythm, right? And dropping that melatonin at the time that you need to, right, to fall asleep and stay asleep. So that's like when we talk about the coaching piece of circadian alignment, that's where you start. You wake up. If you know, all right, I want to wake up at 7. You wake up, and literally as soon as you wake up, get yourself out of bed and get out into the morning sunlight or the morning natural light. It doesn't have to be sunny out, but just you want to get out in natural light. You want to look up at the sky, for at least 5, to 10 minutes, and then go about your day, right? That's going to help set your circadian rhythm.
Okay, so this is super fascinating. Okay, so we want consistent sleep-wake times. We're recognizing that it can be challenging for people in different jobs and different points in their life. But if possible, you're saying one thing you should try and control as much as possible is the same wake time every day. And you are arguing that perhaps even if you're sacrificing 20 minutes or 30 minutes extra sleep, the benefits you get from that consistency outweigh the negatives of not getting enough sleep. Can I just say, in my own experience, and this isn't N=1, that is absolutely true for me. There's no question at all. I am someone who, I think we all do. I thrive on rhythm. Like I am my best version of myself when I'm asleep by 9 o'clock and I'm awake by 5 a.m. When I do that regularly, I'm flying. Like
just firing in all cylinders.
Yes, sport, parenting, work. And when I shift off, when I think, you know what, I'm going to watch something tonight on Netflix a bit later. And, I could tolerate it for one night. Yeah. But I'm not as good the next day. I'm really not. I don't know what's your, I mean, if you're open to share, you look fantastic for being 50 years old.
Thank you.
What time do you go to bed and what time do you wake up?
Yeah, I'm same. Around 9:30, I'm usually asleep by 10 every single night. And I wake up around 6:15, I would say.
Okay.
Pretty much on the dot.
But you've got your rhythm that you try and stick to, basically.
Yeah. So based on the data, I keep my sleep debt under 45 minutes.
What does that mean?
So a sleep debt is basically, Whoop has a feature that it basically tells you kind of what you need based on how efficient last night's sleep is, your baseline sleep. So kind of my sleep characteristics over the last 4 weeks, and then any naps I might have taken and how much load I put on my body during the day. It might say, hey, you need like 12 more minutes of sleep because you really had a super active day, which makes sense, right? Physiologically. So sleep need is not perfect, but I've been able to validate it with some, with NBAC and Stroop. That's another study on psychological safety that was really fascinating. So sleep debt kind of correlates with these kind of performance metrics that we care about. So it's not a random number generator. There is something to our sleep need calculation. So I do listen to it. And in fact, I've seen in a study with 230 collegiate athletes, I've seen sleep debt correlate to, so when athletes are taking on more than 45 minutes of sleep debt, we see they're predisposed to illness and injury. Folks who basically keep it under 45 minutes are essentially bulletproof. So again, seeing this data, I've basically adopted that, and I have not been sick I'm going on 8 years.
Wow.
I did not get COVID. Like I have not a sniffle. Like, I had a headache. I got a little dehydrated after a long run. I had a little bit of a headache, but I literally have not been sick in like 8 years. And
that's a really important point, isn't it? Because we spoke at the start about the importance of a solid circadian rhythm. We spoke about the importance of matching our external behaviors to our internal clock. That affects many things. We mentioned risk of cancer, weight gain, longevity, brain function, energy. But we didn't mention our immune system, right? And you're just speaking to that now because I like you, I'm so passionate about this. A good, robust circadian rhythm, it impacts everything, including your propensity to get sick.
It sure does. Yeah. And I think it kind of goes back to like mechanistically, when you think about when these stress systems are activated chronically, that is when you get sick, right? So HPA axis, autonomic nervous system and your immune system, right? When they're having to work overtime, you are going to be more vulnerable to illness and disease. It's just the reality of the situation, right? So it's about finding, that point of stress. Stress is really good and super important, but there is a point of diminishing return, right? And that's where we need to kind of figure out what is that tolerable level of stress. Like, how do I create enough buffer in the system that I can tolerate these moments where I have a lot of stress? And buffer in the system is minimizing sleep debt, keeping it under 45 minutes. And I would say from a variability perspective, and this is kind of your original question, the other marker I also look at is sleep wake time. And I try to keep my variability below, around 30 minutes.
So as a recommendation for people, try and have the same bedtime and the same wake time. If you're slightly off on your bedtime, try and keep the wake time consistent. If you do need to shift it a little bit day to day, try not to more than 30 minutes or so. Is that kind of the essence of the sleep wake recommendations?
The older you get, the less tolerable your system is going to be to variability, right? You're going to be more sensitive, right, to variability. Now, within that 18 to 23 population, we have some folks who are really sensitive and some folks who aren't. I'm just talking about the mean, right? So of that group was basically 1 hour, right? So, it stands to reason that if this group who's super fit and young, tip of the spear athletically, if their tolerable level of variability is 1 hour, it stands to reason that's going to just keep getting, again, we have to prove this out in the research that we're doing across all the populations, but that I feel like that's probably what's going to happen, right? Is we're going to start to see this kind of window narrow as folks age.
Now, I believe that you think a close second to sleep wake time is a regular eating window. Is that is that still the case? And if so, what is your advice or what are your recommendations there?
Okay, so there's a couple things with the timing of your eating. So we see at population level, it is second only to alcohol in terms of its ability to disrupt our sleep and markers of recovery. So when we look at, when I say markers of recovery, I'm referring to heart rate variability, I'm referring to resting heart rate, respiratory rate. These are kind of our markers of recovery. So, and then sleep, referring to our ability to, get into these deeper stages of sleep. So REM and slow sleep and minimizing our awake time. We're going to have light sleep. That's totally normal and desirable. And it's important. There are really important things happening during light sleep, but we want to have about, 40% of the time that we're spending in bed, we want to be in these deeper stages to restore. So the only thing that moves around our sleep more than alcohol is a late meal. So we're talking like millions and millions of sleep, right? And millions of people kind of reporting over time, right? Like, we're looking maybe at 3 or 4 years of like people reporting late meals. And there's just no question that it has a negative impact on recovery and sleep.
So given that, it's interesting, we spoke before how we're not as different as we might think. And I agree with that. At the same time, I believe there is quite a lot of individual variation in terms of, let's say, the diet we might thrive on, for example, or the movements and the exercise regimes that work really well for us. So I'm really interested, and this is where I find the data that you guys are capturing at Whoop really, really interesting compared to, let's say, a more conventional scientific experiment where people are brought into a lab and, they're taken out of...
The numbers are so small. You can't do within-person statistics, right? Like you can't do multi-level modeling, right? When you have an N of 13. And that's where this is like so exciting, is that we can do within-person analysis, right? And between person, within person, between person, across like, hundreds of thousands of folks, right? So we can actually get to a place where we're saying, hey, this isn't just population level, this is like within person, right? And then we really start to understand, we beat down the variability in a way that, these traditional experiments can't.
So for someone who, let's say, can't afford Whoop and is like, okay, I want to implement stuff from what you have learnt from all that data, but I can't go on that platform myself. Are there any consistencies as to food timing in the evening and its impact on sleep, right? Some people are going to be more tolerable to a late meal than others, but
Yep.
Can you make a generalized recommendation based upon what you've seen? This episode is sponsored by Ketone IQ. Now, I've been following the research around exogenous ketones for many years. Exogenous ketones, basically ketones that we consume as opposed to ones that our bodies make, enable us to experience many of their benefits without necessarily needing to go on a ketogenic diet. There's mounting research on their ability to improve athletic performance and focus, but also growing evidence on the powerful effects of ketones in early cognitive decline. Now, Ketone IQ is a clean shot of high-performance energy with no sugar and no caffeine. I myself have been taking it for the last few months and have been really impressed, not only with its taste, but also how it impacts me when I go for a run. I've also started to take one bottle about 30 minutes or so before every podcast recording. And I've also started an elderly relative with early cognitive decline on it with really promising results. Ketone IQ is also consumed regularly by many of the Tour de France cycling teams and many professional athletes. If you want to give Ketone IQ a go, you can save 30% off your first subscription order and receive a free 6-pack of Ketone IQ by going to ketone.com/live more. That's ketone.com/live more. Just taking a quick break to give a shout out to AG1, one of the sponsors of today's show. Now, AG1 has been in my own life for over 5 years now. It is a science-driven daily health drink with over 70 essential nutrients to support your overall health. It contains vitamin C and zinc, which helps support a healthy immune system, something that is really important, especially at this time of year. It also contains prebiotics and digestive enzymes that help support your gut health. And all this goodness comes in one convenient daily serving that makes it really easy to fit into your life. No matter how busy you feel, it's also really tasty as well. Now, the scientific team behind AG1 includes experts from a broad range of fields, including longevity, preventive medicine, genetics, and biochemistry. And I talk to them regularly, and I'm really impressed with their commitment to making a top quality product. For listeners of my podcast, AG1 are giving a special exclusive offer. You can get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and K2 and 5 free travel packs with your first order. These packs are perfect for keeping in your backpack, office, or car. If you want to give them a try, just go to drinkag1.com/live more.
100%. So, and there's lots of other kind of external literature that supports this as well. So this isn't, just our research, but what we've seen is that, this concept of time restricted eating, which is not intermittent fasting. Okay. And to be clear, I'm not a nutritionist. I can just talk about the timing of things as someone who studies circadian rhythms. But time restricted eating and intermittent fasting, they're often conflated in kind of discussions on the internet and whatnot. But time restricted eating is basically just consolidating your eating window during a period of time during the daylight hours. Okay. So in that window can be 8 hours, it could be 10 hours, it could be 12 hours, right? But the key is you want to eat a bulk of your calories when it is still light out. And then after the sun goes down, we're really not meant to be eating food. We're not primed to metabolize food. And we know from the studies that have looked at insulin at different points of the day, we become way more insulin resistant as the day progresses.
Yeah.
So you want to have like a big, nutrient dense meal early in the day. Breakfast is so important, especially for women, need to be eating breakfast. Lunch is really important. We want to get tons of protein, lots of veggies. Like this is when we're like really primed to metabolize. And then as the day progresses, we want to, decrease our calorie intake, preparing for sleep. Because once we fall asleep, what's happening mechanistically is you have a competition, right? When between digestion and sleep, they can't do both at the same time, right? You're still going to fall asleep, but you're not going to be. It's kind of like alcohol. You're asleep, but you're not in these deeper stages of sleep. So that's what we see in the data. We see that these late meals are compromising deeper stages of sleep. People are spending more time in light sleep by the tune of 30 to 50 minutes. So this is like meaningful amount of time awake. Okay. And an average decrease in sleep efficiency by up to 17% when folks are reporting late meals. Well, it's like wild, right? So food within 2-hour bedtime. So the recommendation is you want to try to back up your meal time. So you're giving at least a 2-hour buffer from your last calorie to when you intend to sleep. And just general rule of thumb, bulk of your calories when you're meant to be active, which is during the daylight. So that's a really big piece to this kind of whole puzzle of, being able to maintain sleep consistency, right? Different foods will potentially impair our ability to fall asleep. That said, I did a study with 700 collegiate athletes where we looked at pre-sleep feeding. And it looks like a bolus of protein that's bioavailable is not really going to impact your ability to, fall asleep and stay asleep. I think it's if we're having that big Indian meal a couple of hours before bed, that's the one that's going to like kind of hit us hard.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, okay, let's unpick that a little bit. Well, I'm very conscious these days, Kristen, more than ever, that we're living in a world of increasing health information on podcasts, on social media, in the media, and it's not always the same, right? Sometimes people are hearing conflicting information.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I have my own views on how we solve that. But in terms of what you've just said, many people have heard over the last few years that this whole idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day is not necessarily true. Many people practice intermittent fasting and they'll have coffee in the morning and they'll delay their first meal till, let's say, 12 o'clock, and they'll eat their second meal at 8 p.m. And they will say that, hey, they're thriving living like that. They're eating good quality food. They're not overeating. So there is an individual variation, I think. But I also agree with what you just said in the sense that all the literature I have seen around circadian rhythms, yes, light is the number one influence on our circadian rhythms, but I think food is number two from what I can tell. And they're sort of saying there's some really good Spanish studies showing that if you have the bulk of your calories in the first half of the day, so let's say before 3 p.m., it's better for weight loss, it's better for blood sugar control, better for sleep. And so,
and that study controlled for diet too, which was awesome. Everyone was eating Mediterranean diet. But folks who were eating after 3 p.m. Yeah.
So I agree. So on a personal level, a few years ago, I did buy an Aura ring. I found that I learned within 6 weeks, maybe less, I kind of feel that I learned what it was going to teach me. And one of the key things I still remember was a late dinner massively impacted the quality of my sleep. And I could see it on the data there. So here's the problem, right? Here's the problem these days is that you may want to live in perfect circadian alignment, but society isn't really set up to support that, right? So for me, sitting down with my wife and children at the end of the day is quite an important family moment, right? So sometimes it does slip on. But having said that, having kids has been the best thing for my circadian rhythm because everything gets shifted back. And I eat early with the kids, and I have done for years, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get to is for someone who just heard what you said, who is saying, you know what, I hear you, but I'm thriving on intermittent fasting at midday and 8 p.m. and I've got energy and focus. What would you say to them?
I can only go back to the literature in terms of what I know and in terms of how we produce insulin and, when we're most resistant and sensitive. And so that said, I think if people are eating, low glycemic
Hmm.
kind of foods, it probably is less important, right? I think it's really if we're just eating, you know, really fatty, high carbohydrate kind of foods, we're over fueling. I think that's when it becomes problematic eating later in the day. But I do think if we're eating really cleanly, and we're keeping kind of our blood sugar at bay, I don't think that that's going to have a huge impact on sleep and recovery. So I do agree that there's variability. I think we can't really ignore the science, though, that the morning time frame is really when
Yeah.
our body is expecting food and when we're really optimized to accept and utilize those nutrients.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we're probably not able to capitalize on that meal as well at 8 p.m. as we are at 8 a.m. And I think that's just the reality of the situation.
I love that. And I think, again, going back to these vicious cycles we get into with our behaviors, if you're eating a large meal at 8 p.m. and you think it's not impacting your sleep, okay, let's just accept that for a moment that it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be hungry first thing in the morning. And so you think, again, you reinforce the belief that, no, I'm not hungry in the morning. But I've done this with patients. I've done it with myself. If you bring your dinner time earlier, if you have a lighter meal, let's say you do eat with your family. This is what I do sometimes. I'll have a soup or a bone broth in the evening. So it's a lighter meal, even though I'm having it maybe closer to bedtime than I would want. So it's going to be easier to digest.
100%.
Then you are hungry in the morning. So it kind of, all of our hunger cycles, our energy, when we feel sleepy, it's kind of all impacted by what we did the day before and what we continue to do. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think people really deeply understand that yet.
Yeah, I think it's, there's a phase relationship, right? And Dr. Samar Hattar, one of my, I just love him. He's done incredible research in the area of circadian physiology, circadian biology. But he says that there's a phase relationship, between our activity, our meals, our sleep, when we view light. And I think to ignore these relationships really comes at an enormous cost, to our health and our functioning. So I think we have to respect this relationship. And, I don't think there's a single reason why we shouldn't try to optimize for it, And I think kind of goes back to just reconfiguring your family a little bit, and I have a couple of teenagers and we just have kind of reorientated ourselves to be able to be more aligned with this natural light dark cycle. And, fortunately, my co-parents super on board, we're able to kind of navigate all that really well. But I think we have oftentimes with our partner, a lot of these kind of hidden commitments that really, I think, pull us a little bit further away from maybe our ability to kind of show up in the world as we want to. And maybe that's that glass of wine at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, or, that we have regularly. And, thinking about, okay, maybe I can, knowing I want to maybe make some of these changes, maybe we can go on a walk instead, or, how do you kind of replace some of these behaviors that are getting in the way? And I think when folks maybe hear this conversation, are it's easy to get a little overwhelmed because they're thinking about all of these commitments that they have with their partner and their family that kind of don't align with this way of living. But it's just a matter of, just reconfiguring things.
That's a great point. On reflection, I don't think I've been out for dinner with my wife, I don't know, in over 5 years. But we've been out for lunch, right? When we were dating, we would have gone out for dinner all the time and stayed up late and all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of interesting that we just realized that we don't want to be out in the evenings for dinner. A, we've got kids. But B, it just doesn't suit the rhythms. And then my sleep in particular, it doesn't suit if I'm eating late. So that's interesting. If I think about these top two behaviors that you are talking about, a consistent sleep wake time and a consistent eating window, and ideally finishing 2 to 3 hours before you want to be falling asleep. Rhythm underpins those two behaviors, doesn't it? Going back to circadian rhythms,
Yeah.
those two are all about rhythm, a consistency with our rhythm. And again, I will share that I mentioned my sleep wake time, 9 till 5 is when I'm at my best. But when I'm eating consistently, for me in a 10-hour eating window, that's the same every day. When I can do that consistently, I just feel my best self. And when I move off it, and occasionally I will, I'm in London for work and there's a dinner, I'll always try and do it earlier. But I'm never quite on it the same day. The next day, I'm never quite on it like I want to be.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where we plan so many aspects of our lives, but we don't necessarily plan, I think, some of the most important things in our lives, like this foundation, right? That's going to allow us to, pursue our values in a way that feels really amazing to us, right? And I think that's kind of, there needs to be some pre-planning in order to make sure on average, you're able to kind of hit your sleep wake targets. You're able to, keep your feeding window, your eating window inside 10 hours, right? And just a quick distinction between intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. I meant to say this before. Intermittent fasting implies some caloric restriction, whereas time restricted eating, and again, going back to this notion that it's free, democratically available, even if you cannot afford really nutrient dense, high quality foods, you can control when you eat your food, right? Even if the food is not as great as it should be, you can get really close to your metabolic goals if you're eating during the daylight hours.
Yeah, I remember when I first found out about Sachin Panda's research, maybe 7-8 years ago, some of the early mouse studies. And I remember a graphic with the mice and how even if they were eating junk, but they were doing it in a confined eating window, the negative impact was just much reduced. It was fascinating. And I think I
have the same graph in my mind.
Yeah, it's this beautiful graphic. And it was just like, oh, wow. And I think it was the first time that I saw something that really connects with me, that something I already intuitively knew, which is that I thrive on rhythm. But when I saw that, I thought, wow, rhythmic living is very, very important. And that's what the modern world has taken away from us. It's kind of decimated that rhythmic nature of life. On that, one thing I'm interested in when you look at your data, I think you're the East Coast of America, right? Where you live.
That's right.
So I live in the northwest of England. And there's huge variation between light dark cycles now as we're recording in nearly midsummer here in the UK, right? So it doesn't get dark till maybe 10:30, 10:45 p.m. and it's light at maybe 4:15 a.m., something like that. And then in November and December around Christmas time, the kids are coming home from school at 4:15 and it's dark, right?
Yeah.
So do you see in the data that our requirement for sleep changes according to the seasons?
Yes. Shorter in the summer, longer in the winter.
Yeah.
We're meant to just kind of adapt to the seasonal variations.
Yeah. It's rhythm. It's rhythm,
It
right?
really is.
It's rhythm.
But people spend 97% of their adult lives indoors.
Yeah. So we're missing the number one input, which is light.
Yeah. Natural light, right? Like artificial light, obviously, after the sun goes down, we have not adapted to blue light after the sun goes down, to be really clear. So that's a lot of the consequences that we're seeing with regard to health. But yeah, just light during the day. Certainly, as the sun is setting, light in the morning when it can impact our circadian rhythms, right? So there's kind of like the circadian dead zone between, I think, 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. generally. So that's why that morning bookending your day with light is so important to set your circadian rhythms. So before 10 a.m., and as the sun is setting, you want to get outside in the light for a minimum of 20 minutes. And then we know that the bare minimum that folks should be spending outdoor is 67 minutes if we are interested in mental health. So just the natural light in general has such an impact on our skin health, on vitamin D, our mental health, our mood, our alertness. So important, right?
Did you say 67 minutes?
Yes, that's what we know in that's kind of the what's been defined in the literature as being like the minimum effective dose of natural light is 67 minutes for humans.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating, and I think that makes complete sense. I mean we've evolved outdoors. We've never spent this long inside. 67 minutes though to some people will be like,
Is
wow,
an eternity.
yeah.
I know.
I'm nowhere near that. And
I know. I mean, yesterday I'm just finishing my dissertation, about to turn it in. But I mean, I did not spend 67 minutes outside yesterday, but I'm acutely aware. And
yeah.
I think if this goes back to the scheduling piece we're talking about, is like, you just have to really, if I know today, fortunately it's a holiday and I'll be outside all the rest of the day. I'm going to kind of make up for it. And I think that it's not a perfect science, but that's kind of in my head how I think about it. And I just try to, on average across a month, schedule my time so I can hit these minimum thresholds.
Yeah.
And that's really how I'm operating.
There's also research now, isn't there, that children, I think, who are not spending, I think it's 2 hours of time outdoors each day, have got an increased risk of myopia.
Yes.
Which is really, really interesting.
Yeah. When it's narrow, like you outside, you're forced to expand your visual, system. And that is, again, when we think about how we've evolved, right? Like we haven't evolved to just like be like this all day long, which is what really people are when you talk about phone consumption and being on screens.
I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, Kristen. I work with one of the most incredible movement coaches I've ever come across. She's just phenomenal. And she's got a machine, there's only about 4 or 5 in the world, where they can track all of your movements as you're running on the treadmill, everything that your spine and your pelvis are doing. It's absolutely incredible. And she can interpret it really well. And here's the thing, when you are moving with peripheral vision, your movement is completely different and more fluid than when you've got concentric vision. So one of the things we're working on is when I'm running is to have that softer peripheral gaze, and you can feel more rotation. So your visual system even impacts the way that you move, which is utterly remarkable.
It is crazy. I mean, just the panoramic vision. And I think what happens physiologically during this is like when we expand our view and kind of create this panoramic vision, we decrease our heart rate and increase heart rate variability. So it's funny, like Rory McIlroy, he's a super famous golfer. He talks about this, like he used to kind of after maybe a bad stroke or like just even as he's walking from hole to hole, he'd look down at the ground, and he learned about this research and started, keeping his shoulders back, looking up, expanding his vision. We also tell kind of surgeons and, folks in kind of these high stress, high stakes environments to expand their vision when they're feeling stressed, because it immediately reduces your heart rate, increases your heart rate variability. So yeah, it's kind of cool to see how vision impacts your physiology in such a profound way. And then obviously biomechanically as well.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, you've touched on alcohol a couple of times. Let's talk about alcohol. What have you seen in the data? Did you say food was worse than alcohol for impacting our circadian rhythms?
It's second
to alcohol.
Yeah. And I think like what's tough about alcohol is like, it's not just impacting you the day after. It has like a 5-day tail.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpick that. So you're saying from the data you've seen, and you're measuring people's heart rate variability and their load and their recovery,
heart rate, their respiratory rate, their activity levels,
So you're saying that, and I want to know what are we talking here? Because let's say someone has 2 glasses of wine, okay, and they feel that they were up a few times at night. They have a bit of a headache the next day. They're craving a bit more caffeine. They're extra hungry, but they decide to compensate. You know what? Today wasn't good. I'm going to go to bed early tonight, eat early, not have any alcohol, and they then get a good night's sleep the following day. I think most people would feel that they're back to normal the next day. It sounds like you're saying from the data that that's simply not the case for most people.
Right. They probably feel better, but physiologically, they're not back to their baseline.
Wow.
So if they're reporting drinking 2+ drinks Okay. So 2 or more drinks, it takes on average 5 days to return to your baseline.
Wow. And
I know.
on average, of course, means that for some people that may be 6 or 7 days, and someone else it could be 3 days. But
Exactly.
that is still
just average across, hundreds of thousands. I mean, at this point, millions, of data sets, right? Over, the course of the time folks have been on the platform. Yeah. It's the average 2+ drinks, average is 5 days to return to baseline. And again, yeah, it could be 2 days for some, 7 days for others. But this is where the problem lies, right? Like you basically inside that window of 5 days, you could be having more drinks, right? And so you just keep pushing. Then that's basically what we see is, folks who have, history of, pretty, lots of alcohol consumption, they come onto the platform with very low heart rate variability.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, we've all got a different tolerance level to alcohol. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So from the data that you've seen, are there people out there who can maybe have a small glass of wine or half a beer in the evening and it not impact their sleep?
Yeah. I mean, I think the key is to make it as far away from your the time you intend to sleep as possible. That's where it just kind of seems to wash away and not impact your sleep. It takes about, so Stress Monitor is a new feature that basically looks at your heart. It's an algorithm that's looking at your heart rate variability and your resting heart rate continuously across the day. And we basically map your stress on a scale of 0 to 3. So I know I'm same as you. Like I don't really drink. I think the last time I drank, I don't even know, but it was a long time ago. But I had a Prosecco and it took 4 hours for it to clear my system. One drink. So, and I looked basically, I went to bed and I think I had the Prosecco at 7, maybe, I went to bed at like 10. And the next day I looked back on my data and my Stress Monitor data, basically what I was elevated in that. Usually when I'm sleeping, I'm in like a 1 stress, right? 3 is super high, 1 is really low. So I'm kind of 0.7, whatever. So it was basically, I was like 2.7, 3.2 was the highest. And then it kind of started to go down, but it basically took 4 hours for that 1 Prosecco to clear my system before I was like back down to like my typical stress level.
Wow.
So the front end of my sleep was compromised after 1 drink. And again, that could just be my tolerance level, to your point, my weight, like all of that is going to impact how it absorbs and how I digest, and metabolize the alcohol. But
I've had a theory for a while that is around our total stress load, right? So we've got all kinds of inputs into our life, work stress, life stress, emotional stress, training stress, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got a certain amount of headroom left to deal with other stress.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I used to drink alcohol regularly many years ago,
yeah, you wipe away that headroom.
well, yeah, but what I noticed was that, let's say, I don't know, in my late 20s, for example, if I was a junior doctor, right? So busy, working shifts, night shifts, all kinds of things, right? So knackered all the time and just getting by. I would find that a glass of wine in the week, I just couldn't tolerate that well, right? Or maybe it's in my 30s. I'm like, it was a while ago now, right?
Yeah.
But there was a point in time in my life where during the work week, I realized that drinking any alcohol, it just wasn't agreeing with me. But if I was on a holiday, so I was on a beach somewhere, it was sunny, I was chilled, I wasn't doing any work, then that same glass of wine wouldn't have the same impact on me. And I thought, wow, or certainly this, I wasn't tracking anything. This was purely my perception. I thought, this is really, really interesting. Maybe it's to do with my background stress load and the headroom left that I have now to deal with this toxin into my body. What's your perspective on that based upon what you've seen?
Yeah, I love that. I call it kind of buffer. You want to try to, I think the more external stress in your life, the more you want to, this is kind of like I say with military operators, acute care surgeons, people in these high stakes, high stress environments. I kind of say, hey, this is the cross you have to bear, like outside your craft, because of its demands and the stress, just like you, junior doctor, right? Like the demands and stress of just living that life. Everything else kind of needs to be perfect. And that's the cross that folks bear in these high stakes, high stress environments, right? If you don't want to compromise your health and your longevity and just kind of maintain a little bit of a neutral state, pay down illness and injury risk, you kind of need to really dial in on your nutrition, your hydration, obviously to the degree that you can stabilize your sleep-wake time, just getting this bookend of light as often as possible, thinking about your social connections, surrounding yourself with people who, nurture and support your values. So important. So there's just like these things, like these boxes that you need to kind of be checking when you're in these situations where you have a lot of stress. Maybe you're caring for an ill child or a parent, or, like there's things that life is going to throw at us. Right. And I think, and we're all going to face these moments. And I think that's kind of why, in some ways, like I try to live the way that I do, is like, I know I'm going to encounter those moments and I want to be ready for it. I want to be able to handle it, with, a sense of balance and proportion and grace. And if I am, all over the place with my lifestyle, I'm just not going to be able to do that. So I think there's this thing about creating buffer in the system to be able to deal with the natural kind of variations in demand and priorities across, a month, a week, a month, a year.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Before we move on from alcohol, just to sort of finish off then, do you think that some people can tolerate a little bit of alcohol without too much of an effect on their sleep and or their resting physiological states? Are some people, can they metabolize it better and they can deal with half a glass of wine 3 nights a week and they can still function well? Like, do you see people on the platform where you go, actually, they're drinking, but it doesn't seem to be affecting them much?
No.
Wow.
No one is immune to, that I've seen. When people drink, it impacts their resting heart rate and their heart rate variability and their respiratory rate.
Wow.
And their sleep markers. Like, it just is, it's pretty ubiquitous. I mean, there might be the outlier here and there that, I can't, I'm not going to do a statistical fist fight with those folks. But I can say that, from what I've seen in our data, which is massive amounts of data at this point, it appears that no amount of alcohol is good for your resting physiology.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I mean, that's pretty clear on your view on alcohol and what it's doing to us.
It's so hard seeing the data. It's really striking, it's like very hard for me to have any other point of view because I see it so black and white, clear as day.
I think I saw that also when I was wearing a tracker. And I think I also, from recollection, saw that, wow, this is what a glass of wine is doing to your sleep. And once you've seen it, and I guess some people need to see it over and over again, but for me, I saw it to go, okay, I get it now. I can see what's happening. I can feel it subjectively, and I can see it in the data objectively. So both of those things together are sending me a strong signal. What's the deal with caffeine from what you've seen?
Yeah. So, again, same sort of thing as alcohol. Like, we all metabolize it a little bit differently. Some people can, metabolize caffeine very quickly. Others are slow metabolizers. So I think understanding kind of where you sit is important. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, we see caffeine after 3 p.m. impacts sleep onset. So when people fall asleep, it delays when folks are drinking caffeine after 3.
Wow.
Yeah. That one's really pretty clear.
Do you, understanding that we're all different and that if we don't have access to our own data, we have to go on generalized recommendations, you're pretty confident that you can make a recommendation about sleep wake time, about eating windows, about alcohol, like some universal
Mhm.
recommendations for people.
Yes, of
Do
course.
do you
Average.
have
Yeah.
a universal recommendation regarding caffeine?
Yeah, I would say most folks should probably have their last sip of caffeine by noon.
Yeah.
And I would say for folks who have short sleep. So let's just say you had short sleep. You're waking up at that normal. Your body is going to wake up. If you've been waking up relatively consistently, your body is going to naturally, that cortisol, that bolus of cortisol is going to just happen on its own. So you're going to kind of wake up or want to wake up at that time, even if you've had short sleep. So let your body wake up at 7 and actually don't have caffeine, but actually take a nap at 11 if you can. That's like the best way to deal with short sleep and maintaining circadian rhythm. Have a bit of a rest that doesn't impact your biological sleep at night. So any naps you want to kind of try to take before 1 p.m. And then same philosophy with caffeine. I would say 1 p.m. would be like the hard stop for, in my view, for naps based on what I've seen in the data and caffeine.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point about naps. It's something I've done for many years. Is if I'm able to, it depends what my work is for that day, but if it's a work from home day to have flexibility, for example, then I will maintain my 5 a.m. wake up time, and I'll just try and get a short nap at some point in the day if I can, even if I don't even sleep and I just shut my eyes for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It is amazing what benefit that has.
Yeah, we're about to analyze our yoga nidra data. I have a script out there on the internet that I did. We use this with frontline healthcare clinicians and elite athletes. Like a lot of folks in these kind of high stakes, high stress environments, struggle with napping because they're just chronically activated. But yoga nidra, which is just basically a mind body scan, is just an awesome alternative to napping and actually mimics slow wave sleep. This is not research that we've done, but external research to Whoop that I saw that was really cool. So yoga nidra is another kind of strategy I think folks can deploy when they have short sleep and they're looking to increase their alertness.
Can you explain to people what that is for people who've never heard that term before?
Yeah, yoga nidra, it's a yogic practice, and it basically involves just very simply a mind body scan, and you just listen to a script 15, 20 minutes. I think there's some 10-minute scripts out there. And it basically just kind of takes you head to toe, where you just journey through sensing different parts of your body. You don't move, you just kind of sit there and you're in like this awake state that feels really meditative. Like once you get going and you just feel really calm and centered. It's pretty amazing. And you actually might fall asleep. So it's good just even if you to start with this yoga nidra practice, and you actually might find yourself being able to nap, because it really does. Again, if you are actually carrying a bit of sleep debt, you're going to feel sleepy, and you might actually fall asleep with this yoga nidra.
Yeah, it's something many people find useful. There's loads of free kind of scripts there on YouTube for people to check out and find one that they like. It reminds me of a post, a friend of mine, Brian McKenzie, who I think you might know as well.
Yeah.
Like I had Brian on the show a few years ago.
He's so good.
He's great. And he, I think he did a post on Instagram a few years ago. I think his dog had fallen asleep in the afternoon in front of the fire. And I can't remember what he said, but it was something like, that's the kind of stress response system type vibe we need. We should be able to just switch off and take a nap like a dog can. But the fact that we can't is because we've got all this stuff on our head and we're overthinking and we're ruminating. And that really connected with me, because I thought, that's hard for many people. I found that hard in my life at various times, and I still can do if I've got too much on my plate. So 100%. I just thought it was a beautiful image to go, wouldn't it be nice if humans, if we could just switch off and take a nap on tap when we need to?
I mean, I think that's the superpower of the 21st century, is being able to be, activate when you want to activate and deactivate when you want to deactivate, and having enough buffer in the system to be able to kind of fire up your autonomic nervous system like on demand.
Yeah.
And, be able to intentionally increase your heart rate, intentionally decrease your heart rate. I mean, that's autonomic control, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's like, the call to arms here, and I think that the second and third order effect of that is, when we can control our physiological state, we can control our attention.
Yeah.
And I think that's the real power, right, in this world, right? Because there is just the internet, that everything is just, it's designed, it's curated to take our attention. It's robbing us of like our own compass for what we want to do in our life. It's just, that's a whole other discussion, but
it's bang on. I'm totally in agreement with that. You have written the most beautiful article on your LinkedIn page about attention, and
thank you.
I was reading all those LinkedIn articles today. They were really, really brilliant. And if we have time, which I suspect we won't today, we'll get into that. So I'll have to save that for a part 2, if not. But I did say we're going to cover shift workers, because I think that's important for people who've heard all this stuff. Are there any other behaviors that, we mentioned sleep wake time, eating windows, alcohol, caffeine, a bit of yoga nidra. Are there any, before we get on to shift work, are there any other kind of behaviors you're really keen to share with people?
Yeah. I mean, I think just leading into the conversation around shift workers, I think like it's all relative, but I think a lot of folks have what they would perceive as really stressful lives, right? So number one, this is a study we just finished with our membership base. We had, I think, 19,000 folks participate. We were taking blood pressure readings over the course of 3 blood pressure readings over the course of 3 weeks. And then we asked them questions about their perception of their day and the reflection of their day. So did they perceive their day as threatening, or did they perceive it as challenging? Okay. That was one question. Then we had a bunch of questions about sleep anxiety. But the threat and challenge was really interesting in that. So we're monitoring stress throughout the day. So we've got, again, an algorithm that is looking at heart rate variability, resting, and heart rate, 24/7. And the algorithm basically maps that on a scale of kind of 1 to 3. The higher in that zone, the higher stress you are. And what was so interesting is that when people perceive their day as challenging, they end up in the higher stress zone. But what's so interesting is that, and when they perceive it as threatening, they actually are less stressed.
Wow.
So there's some sort of like paralyzing effect. And what's even cooler is that there is a relationship between if you perceive it as threatening versus challenging, how that impacts your sleep and recovery next day.
Wow.
So the more challenging you perceive stress, the better you sleep and the better you wake up to the next day. The more threatening you perceive the stress to be, the less well you sleep, the less recovered you are tomorrow.
Is that to do with mindset and growth mindset, for example?
Yeah, totally. Right. So, and I think like, I think a lot about like the model that I've been working off of for like the last 2 decades, has mindset in it. But I think my point of view is that it's hard to just talk ourselves into a better future, right? When we're short slept and when we have circadian misalignment and when we don't have purpose and efficacy and control, like these core psychological needs, that we don't have an infrastructure to kind of think about those and support those needs. Our mindset is going to be compromised, right? So I think a lot of the models out there talk about mindset, but they forget how physiological and psychological influences actually show up in our mindset. Right? I'm going to be much more capable of perceiving my day as challenging if I have a decent amount of sleep, if I have, positive relationships in my life, if I feel like I have the skills and resources to take on the tasks in my day, I'm going to perceive the day as more challenging, right? So it's way more complicated, right? There's a lot more variables, I think, happening or influencing mindset than I think a lot of the models that exist currently. Yeah. I find them very, very deficient.
Yeah. Our physiology affects our psychology, and our psychology also affects our physiology. It's the way I've been thinking about this for the last year. So I've been writing a book about some of this, right? Not quite in through that lens, but this whole idea that, I don't know, let's say you're at work and you receive an email from your boss. The state of your nervous system at that time will determine how you interpret that email, right? So if you're underslept, overcaffeinated, you're
underfueled, overfueled, dehydrated.
You can read that email as threatening. The boss wants to fire me. They're not happy with me. If you are calm and relaxed and everything's going well at home and you slept well, you're less likely to interpret as threatening. At the same time, I kind of feel that you can train yourself to not take offense, to not see that as threatening. Go, okay, that's an email. That's just a neutral email. How I interpret it is up to me, and how you interpret it then will affect your physiology. If you interpret it as threatening, then your heart rate's going up, your breathing rate's going up. So I don't know. I feel that we might be on similar pages with this, but
we are 100%.
It's a two-way system, isn't it?
It really is. And I think what the opportunity is that, and I said, oh, there's a lot of variables. There's really not that many variables. Like when I look at my model, I basically have, if you have purpose, if you have self-efficacy and you have control and you're, slept, you have appropriate sleep, circadian rhythms, and, you're training and you're working on your fitness, like it's really kind of those 6 things, right, that are going to impact your mindset. So your ability to kind of perceive the day, have optimism about the day, and feel like, challenged by the stress ahead is contingent on kind of these 6 things, right? And so when people are wondering, oh, why is my motivation all over the place? Why do I some days perceive things as stressful? Sometimes I perceive them as, as threatening. Sometimes I perceive them as challenging. It's often because people don't have an infrastructure to think about purpose, right? Aligning their behaviors with what they say they care about, right? When that's off, that dissonance is going to affect your mindset. Okay. Or, you know what? I don't have the skills and resources to do what is being asked of me today, right? That's going to throw off my mindset. I don't have control. I don't feel like I have autonomy over my day, right? And you can think about this in the context of kids too, right? Like when they feel like they don't have like a sense of control or autonomy, or don't have the skills to do what mom and dad or teachers are asking of them, like stuff goes awry really, really fast, right? And that impacts mindset. But this is the stuff that I don't think is really talked about in a coherent way. Everything is really silent. And that's what I struggle with the field of psychology and physiology. They're so siloed. And that's really, if I make any contribution to this world, like bringing these 2 things together in like a very coherent way is really my life's work, is what I want my life's work to be.
I love it. Honestly, I absolutely love it. They have to be brought together. They can't exist in isolation. Okay, before I go down a rabbit hole there, which I want to at the moment, I must deal with night shift workers, because I said I would at the start, and I really don't want people leaving this feeling worried and scared, right? So,
I know.
You did a series of beautiful Instagram videos, which I would direct people to if they want to know your views on this, right?
Yes.
One was, if you're on a series of night shifts. So, I don't know, when I was a junior doctor, we would do 7 nights in a row, for example.
Right.
You had some advice on how to stay on a night pattern. I wonder if you could share some of your top line recommendations there, please.
Yeah. So if you are trying to stay on your nighttime shift pattern, you'll get home from your shift around, let's just say 7 a.m. And in the lead up, if you can, and again, this is the caveat, is you need to be able to do this, all of these things I'm talking about, as safely as possible, right? So in the lead up to your shift, so let's go back the other direction. So let's say you're waking up at 3 p.m., 4 p.m. You want to try to get as big a meal at that time as possible when you're still relatively primed, less insulin resistant. You want to try to, eat as much food as you can during that time, because what you don't want to do is eat over the course of the nighttime. That's going to put extra stress on the system. So if you are eating during that time, eating really nutrient dense food, stuff that is easily digestible, and then if you can have a really healthy breakfast before at the back end of your shift, in what would be kind of that morning time frame, that would be ideal, right? Again, your body's kind of primed to metabolize and use those nutrients. But again, I think it has to be low glycemic load because you don't want it to impact your sleep, which is going to, you're going to need to sleep around 7, probably, shortly after the end of your shift. So, and you want to try to, I think sleeping as close to the end of your shift is, from what I've seen, what I've heard, and in the data that we have on frontline healthcare clinicians, that seems to be the best situation to get, the best protocol to get in the most hours of sleep during the night and have the most restorative sleep. People who delay their sleep end up with much shorter sleep and more fragmented sleep. Okay. So once you get back from, once you try to minimize light in the lead up to bed. So sunglasses, hat, again, as safely as you can, because that light to the eye, again, is really going to wake up the system. So, a nice protein rich meal, just to make sure you're not hungry during sleep. And you're kind of capitalizing on that moment where your body's, kind of primed to metabolize food. Get your protein, minimize light, and try to go to bed as soon as you can once you get home from your shift. And then sleep, try to get a consolidated sleep, 7 hours. And then when you wake up, work out, have a meal, be active, catch up with the family before you go on to your shift.
Yeah. And
then once you're on your shift, you're doing your normal thing, stay hydrated. I think, there's all sorts of types of shift workers, right? Manufacturing, not just frontline healthcare, but hospitals in general are really, really dry. I think it's like as dry as the Sahara Desert or something. It's like they're super dry. So you want to drink a lot of water. Because that's like the third thing that impacts sleep and recovery is dehydration.
Right. So hold on, remind us of the first two.
So you want to block light in the lead up to sleep, right? As much as possible to kind of signal to your body that it's time to sleep. If you need, a high protein, easily digestible, shake or whatever, just to get some extra calories before you sleep, you can do that. And then you want to try to sleep, for 7 hours minimum. So you want to get a consolidated sleep. And then once you wake up, have a big meal, work out, visit with your family, whatever your setup is. And then that would be a time where you can have some caffeine. And again, you want to make sure you stop caffeine, at least 8 hours before you intend to sleep. And that's another thing where people go wrong on night shift is they're having a lot of caffeine, right? Which puts a lot of stress on the system.
So if you're going to be sleeping at 8 a.m., that means, let's say you're a hospital worker at midnight, you don't want to be having caffeine, But that it's just a vicious cycle, isn't it? Because if you need the caffeine to keep you awake, to be alert. Yeah.
Creatine would be the other recommendation that I think I talk about in the post. But there's been some really interesting recent research looking at the impact of creatine and sleep deprivation, and that it's protective against the symptoms of sleep deprivation.
Wow.
So there's something really powerful happening with creatine in the brain. And most people are probably a little creatine deficient. You can find it in foods, but I think especially people who are in, these really demanding, shift work type of jobs, they're, oftentimes not able to get the meals on board that they need. So supplementation actually becomes really important for this population. So creatine is one that from the literature I would recommend.
Okay, great. So we're using light, food, caffeine, exercise, and creatine to help manipulate the circadian rhythm so that you can stay on night shift.
And most importantly, decrease, it's like you're trying to, it's stressful, right? So we don't want to layer that more stress on top, right? By, this protocol that I outlined is going to minimize the stress on the system.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And how do you advise that people go from night shift back onto day shift then?
Yeah. So, okay. So let's say you get home at 7 o'clock. This is a time where have a nice big breakfast. Do not have coffee or any caffeine. I'm going to tell you why that's really important in a second. So, have your breakfast, get that big bolus of light. Okay. Sunshine, natural light, even if it's cloud covered, get out for as long as you can. exercise, be active, you are going to start to have massive sleep pressure around 11 or 12, provided you didn't have caffeine. Okay. That is the time where you want to just crush a nap. And what's important is obviously you've been up all night, right? So you're going to be very sleep deprived, but we want to try to protect your sleep that night. Okay. So we want to have, a 90-minute to 3-hour nap. You don't want to sleep more than that because again, you want to be able to fall asleep at night. But you're going to have a lot of sleep debt on board. So get that, 3-hour nap, wake up, have a green tea. Okay. Some sort of, caffeine, natural caffeine, if you can, and this is the time, do your errands, be with your family, get a nice dinner on board. And then when you naturally feel sleepy is when you want to succumb to that sleep pressure. And then aim to wake up the next day at the same time you saw light the previous morning.
Okay. Yeah. It's all there in those Instagram posts, and you explained it really well. Yeah. And I think there was enough there for people to at least take it on board and go, okay, these are things I can manipulate. And again, zooming out, it's this theme throughout this conversation that we have a circadian rhythm. It's important as much as we can, and some people are going to struggle for sure, that we match those external behaviors to our internal circadian rhythms. We can use a variety of different things to do that. Light exposure, food, timing, exercise, hydration.
Caffeine.
Yeah. Actually, if you can learn to master this, you kind of become a master of your physiology because you understand how to manipulate it, right?
Yeah. I think that this is very much the path to mastery. Just learning and attention. And, that's a whole nother kind of discussion. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is really, it gives us the foundation, I think, to live our values with, joy and energy. Okay. And I think that's kind of at a fundamental level what we're all after,
I completely agree. Okay, before we finish, Kristen, I must talk to you about the pros and cons of trackers. So,
yes.
I'll give you my perspective to start off, okay? So, my perspective is that trackers can be useful to help us tune in to our internal physiology. For me, the goal has always been, though, to not get dependent and overly reliant on trackers. I want them to teach me. So I do not have a Whoop band, okay? So you obviously work for Whoop, and the data you have accumulated is just phenomenal. I'm very interested in that data and what we can all learn from it. Are you able to make the case to me why I might benefit from wearing a Whoop strap?
Well, I think having your baseline data is a pretty incredible source of insight in terms of how you're tracking, and whether or not how you're living, how you're managing stress, whether or not it's working for you. And I think you mentioned this earlier, there's lots of subjective questions, that we should be asking ourselves, around what are my energy levels? Do I feel alert when I want to feel alert? Do I feel sleepy when I want to feel sleepy? Am I attending to things that I care about? Am I able to control and direct my thoughts, right? Like these are questions that all humans should be asking of themselves, right? Because the answer to those questions is a direct comment on how likely how we're managing our physiology. I think where the data become really interesting is when there is that change in your life, or you have, maybe your period is becoming irregular, and you want to try to triangulate and understand why that might be happening. Am I entering perimenopause? Am I entering menopause? Like what, so I think you're taking on more stress in your life, and you notice, wow, okay, it is actually impacting my sleep objectively. Now I know where to apply my effort. And I think at a baseline, to answer your question, I want to know how to apply my effort. And I feel like Whoop is, constantly kind of coaching me, so I can show up as the best version of myself. It's helping me understand, how to align my sleep wake times. What is my sweet spot for the time I need to spend in bed? Like, just being able to keep a check weekly. I'm not obsessing over my data, but I love that weekly readout where I can see, hey, my sleep debt's creeping up to an hour and 10 minutes. I know that, hey, 45 minutes is the sweet spot. That's where I stay bulletproof. I need to reorg this week to make sure that I'm kind of hitting that target. Oh, my sleep wake variability is increasing. Wow, I'm up to almost an hour. I need to dial that in. It's hard to keep track of all that, right? There's a lot of cognitive load associated with just, kind of knowing where we sit inside these metrics that ladder up to my ability to be the best version of myself. It's not a gazillion things, right? It's just a few things, right, that I'm really paying attention to on the daily.
Yeah, I can believe that for sure. And so if you're not in tune with your body at all, I can see a really powerful case to go, look, let me at least start understanding what's going on when I do this. When I have alcohol, oh my God, my sleep goes down. Yeah. Okay, that could really help you change your behavior. Do you think someone could get obsessed and check it every day? And I'm not saying, look, I always talk about blood pressure monitors because I've seen this for many years, that about 50% of patients, okay, just a rough average, would thrive if they bought a home blood pressure monitor. They'd use it a few times a week. It would help
keep them in check.
Keep them in check. Yeah. But the other half would be obsessive with them, check it 3-4 times a day. As soon as
like a CGM, I'd be like, I was just like insane.
Yeah. And so what was fascinating for me is because that then, we're all biased by our own experiences. So I have a bias based upon what I saw with blood pressure monitors, which are very different kinds of monitors, I accept, to go, okay, I think our personality probably plays a huge role as to whether we're going to obsess with this or use it as a tool for self-improvement. So on Whoop, because I'm interested in trying it, because I kind of think,
you need to try it. I'd be so curious.
I'm open-minded to stuff. So I've tried lots of stuff. It's just I haven't tried that yet. And I'm sort of tempted to go, okay, well, what am I going to learn? Is it something I can look at once a week and it not affect my day-to-day? Because I also like knowing what's going on with my physiology. So you're basically thinking I should try it.
Well, I think the science is so good, and the underlying data that informs our algorithms is just like, it's the best on the market. It's like super high fidelity. There's no watch. It's just literally collecting data. And I love that just from the standpoint of like attention. Like I don't want
that's interesting
messages coming on my wrist. You know?
So that's interesting. So you can't actually check it in real time. It's kind of.
No, you have to actively go into your app to see the data.
So that's quite a nice way of making sure it doesn't take over people's lives. So
Yeah. And that's by design.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's it's not a watch.
Do you see it as something that people could wear several times a year, or do you think the benefit comes from wearing it 24/7?
I mean, I think there's so much benefit to just having it on, there's just so many cool insights. And of course, I love it, because it's just, we keep evolving, we keep making it better. Like our coaching gets better, the AI is so fun. I work on the coaching aspect of the app, because I was a coach for so many years. So that's kind of my jam. But I think just people have different entry points, right? And what you need to focus on is different than me, is different than the person on my left and right for the most part. But we all kind of have these fundamental things that we should be paying attention to, which we've outlined in this discussion, and you can track in Whoop, which is cool, right? And you can start to see the impact and core 4, this paper that hopefully will make it through peer review and be able to be out into the world. This is a great example of how 4 behaviors that we ran as a challenge. It was time restricted eating, zone 2 cardio, breath work, and morning sunlight. Okay, shifted people's circadian rhythms and improved cardiorespiratory fitness and parasympathetic activity, in ways that are just kind of mind blowing. Right. And it was just it was beautifully controlled. We had a match control. We know their journal history. We know the folks that in the challenge that journal these behaviors before. We know folks that never journaled them. We see the changes. It's just, so I think there's lots of opportunities to start to understand the impact of behaviors on these metrics that ladder up to health span, right?
Yeah.
And to your longevity. So you start to be able to, I think for me, I've never been closer to my body. And I never have understood my mind and body better than I do today. And I honestly could say I just would never have been able to do that without the data.
Yeah.
It just puts the puzzle together for me. It's a wisdom accelerator. It like accelerates your wisdom. And I am so much smarter because I understand my body so much better.
Yeah.
I know what an ice bath does and what hot does and how it affects me and what the right dose for me is, how much time I need to spend in bed. All this I would never have known.
No, I love that. And if we had longer, which we don't today, I would absolutely be jumping off there to be talking about how it's helped you tune into your intuition. But let's save that for a part 2 at some point. Maybe next time you're in the UK or when I'm in America. I've thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with you today. I really have. I think you're doing incredible work, honestly. And I love the way you communicate your ideas. For someone who's heard us today, Kristen, who is really struggling in their life and they just feel their health is not going the way that they want it to do. Let's say they can't afford Whoop or technology like that. I know we've covered a lot today. What advice would you have for someone who feels that life's not going their way and they really want to break out of these patterns, but they don't know how? What would you say to them?
I'd say get off the phone, get outside. Whatever you can spare, however much time you can spare outside, getting your eyes up, looking into the eyes of other humans, looking at the trees and the birds. And I know we haven't talked about it today, but, like nature just has saved my life. And I think that we are so disconnected from like the natural beauty in the world. And I think that's the place to start. And it's free. And I think just take time to, again, away from your phone, like to listen to your thoughts. And a lot of those thoughts are nonsense. Some of those thoughts are worth keeping. But I think, really connecting and asking those questions of yourself of who you want to be and what are the things that you need to bring in your life so you can practice being that person. And maybe it's just, increasing your patience and your tolerance and, thinking about how you are with your children. And I think those kind of things, the things that are absolutely free and available to all of us, is the place to start. And if you can get that right, a lot of other things in your life will start to fall into place.
Kristen, it's a beautiful answer. Thanks for all the work you're doing. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been so fun.
Really hope you enjoyed that conversation. Do think about one thing that you can take away and apply into your own life. And also have a think about one thing from this conversation that you can teach to somebody else. Remember, when you teach someone, it not only helps them, it also helps you learn and retain the information. Now, before you go, just wanted to let you know about Friday 5. It's my free weekly email containing 5 simple ideas to improve your health and happiness. In that email, I share exclusive insights that I do not share anywhere else, including health advice, how to manage your time better, interesting articles or videos that I've been consuming, and quotes that have caused me to stop and reflect. And I have to say, in a world of endless emails, it really is delightful that many of you tell me it is one of the only weekly emails that you actively look forward to receiving. So if that sounds like something you would like to receive each and every Friday, you can sign up for free at drchatterjee.com/Friday5. Now, if you are new to my podcast, you may be interested to know that I have written 5 books that have been bestsellers all over the world, covering all kinds of different topics: happiness, food, stress, sleep, behavior change, and movement, weight loss, and so much more. So please do take a moment to check them out. They are all available as paperbacks, ebooks, and as audiobooks, which I am narrating. If you enjoyed today's episode, it is always appreciated if you can take a moment to share the podcast with your friends and family, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful week. And please note that if you want to listen to this show without any adverts at all, that option is now available for a small monthly fee on Apple and on Android. All you have to do is click the link in the episode notes in your podcast app. And always remember, you are the architect of your own health. Making lifestyle changes is always worth it, because when you feel better, you live more.